The movie opens at the funeral of Darren Shawn, an adolescent boy. Everyone there is devastated by his death. Surprisingly, however, it turns out that he is still alive. In fact, he is seen playing video games inside the coffin. The scene cuts to the past, where Darren describes how well his life was going. He had cool friends, got good grades, and was popular in school. The only negative aspect of his life was Steve, his childhood best friend. One day at school, Steve persuades Darren to skip their history class. The two then head to the roof, where Steve throws stones at several light bulbs and challenges his friend to do the same. However, their history teacher hears the commotion from the roof at that exact moment. Consequently, the boys are caught, and Darren's parents are informed that he is the worst offender because his parents had always considered him to be an excellent student. They discipline him with brutality and ground him for 2 months. Besides, they prohibit him from remaining companions with Steve, referring to that he is a terrible impact. It's valid. Steve's the Dutch. The following day while strolling to school, Darren informs Steve that his folks maintain that he should sever their fellowship. After hearing this, the last option is demoralized and he blames Darren for never defending himself as they fight. A limousine passes by and a man inside tosses out a flyer which lands before them. It ends up being a solicitation to a carnival occasion called. According to the flyer, it is a freak show that only happens once every 500 years. The boys recall that their teacher warned them not to go to the show because it was illegal. However, they still decide to go to the circus that night, when Darren and Steve sneak out of their homes and ride their bicycles to the circus. It becomes clear that the boys have unusual hobbies. Darren loves spiders a lot. While Steve is at the venue obsessing over vampires, they purchase a ticket from a dwarf-like humanoid creature concealed behind a curtain. But when Steve hands over the money, the animal nibbles his hand, flies away. The boys ignore the bizarre occurrence and enter the theater. As soon as the host, Mr. Tall, takes the stage, it becomes clear that the show has attracted people of all ages, primarily adults and seniors. He expressed gratitude toward the crowd for proceeding, introducing a few weird oddities before them from the outset. Mr. Tall directs the wolf man toward a woman in the audience, and to everyone's horror, the wolf man tears off her hands. His presence frightens everyone. However, the woman regenerates her hand and walks toward the stage as if nothing had happened. Mr. Tall then introduces her as Cornell Limbs, another freak show participant. Alexander Ribs, a man with no apparent ribs, is the next member. Alexander Gertha Teeth, the third member, can surprisingly break anything with her strong teeth. Romance Two Bellies, on the other hand, allows her partner to eat anything, including swallowing a tricycle whole and spitting it out intact. On stage, Madame Trusta, a beautiful freak, calls Darren and asks him to be her assistant. However, she touches his face. She detects something taboo within him and steps back as the presentation proceeds. Madame Truska wows the crowd by developing beard growth in a moment, yet after her demonstration, she out of the blue requires the show to be gotten together notwithstanding her solicitation. Steve recognizes L. Arton Crespi from a book about the empires and whispers to Darren that he is actually a vampire named their Hostin just as the show is interrupted by police and townspeople. The next act features L. Arton Crespi and his spider partner Octa. They impress the audience with a dance performance while playing an instrument. While the adults argue, Darren sneaks backstage and steals Octa, including the boys' history teacher, captivated by its vibrant exterior, but as he tries to leave, he is forced to hide when someone enters the room, and to his surprise, an elderly man and a hybrid group are discussing the threat. I hope you're all writing this down, vampires, because I have no idea what the hell has happened suddenly. Steve storms in and begs them to turn him into a vampire, claiming that he despises his life because he doesn't have anyone to share it with. After a lot of convincing, Lurden finally gives in and decides to taste Steve's blood. It turns out that Steve's father has been missing for a long time and that Steve's mother is a drunk. However, he refuses to transform the boy into a vampire as soon as he puts it in his mouth because he is aware that Steve is a bad person. Martin eventually realizes that his spider has vanished, prompting him to flee in rage. However, Darren panics and flees before Martin can check the door. When Darren reaches the road, he is picked up by the same car with two men inside. Merlot and Mr. Tiny begin questioning him, but it soon becomes clear that they picked the wrong boy. In fact, They were looking for Steve's friend, so they dropped him off at his house without first informing him that they would be there. The following day, in the hope of safeguarding her, Darren packs an additional school in his bag. Steve, on the other hand, sees them before the class even begins, so he begins playing with the spider and accidentally drops her on the floor, allowing her to escape, rather than attempting to capture the spider. Having had enough, Octave finally decides to act, biting Steve on the cheek before escaping through the window as a result. Steve chases her with the intention of killing her, causing a lot of chaos in the school's hallways. Many students run away in fear, and some even get hurt. In the following scene, he falls to the ground and is knocked out by the venom. Darren rushes back to the circus and begs Larden to save his friend. Concerned about the consequences of a human finding out about their existence, Larden initially declines to assist. He eventually agrees to provide the remedy, but only if the Baron agrees to become his assistant vampire, leaving behind his friends and family. Baron will also have to give up his entire social life to attend school. Darren, who is desperate to save his friend, agrees to the terms and receives Larkin's vampire blood. They then race to the hospital to save Steve's life. Larden immediately administers the antidote, which fortunately works, and Steve begins to recover the movie. He will have to die despite the consequences of his diary. The scene then cuts to a few days later, when Darren can feel his body reacting to the vampire blood of Larson. He begins hankering crude meat one day. However, he also experiences the extremely enticing urge to kill and consume his sister's blood. In the end, he stops wanting blood and runs back to his room, where he finds Larden alert and sitting in the corner reading a book. Larden tells Darren that he needs to leave his house because he is a danger to himself and his family. Even though Darren does not want to, he has come very close to harming his own sister. However, he also decides to leave because he does not want his parents to continue to worry about him indefinitely. Sometime thereafter, on the roof of the house, Larden helps Darren in the demonstration by breaking his neck. This will cause everybody to accept that he coincidentally tumbled to his downfall. The film then slices to the present at Darren's burial service. Every one of his companions, Darren's teachers and family pay their respects in the same night while he is alive and well inside the coffin and playing games on his phone. Fortunately, El Arton fights Merlo off and manages to temporarily subdue him. Following the close call, he takes her into the freak show campgrounds, where they meet a girl named Rebecca. Meanwhile, Larden digs up the grave and frees Darren from the coffin before they can leave. As a result, Steve's friend's death has left him devastated. When the pain makes him feel ashamed, he isolates himself from society and becomes a maniac. Just as he is about to commit the unthinkable, Mr. Tiny shows up and stops him. He says that he is aware of Steve's unfortunate life and his love of vampires in general, and gives him the opportunity to become a vampire. As Steve hears everything in disbelief, Mr. Tiny reveals something even more shocking. He claims that Darren is alive and content in the other world, something Steve did not know. It turns out that Mr. Tiny and Merlo are vampires, a distinct race of vampires who, in contrast to Larden and the others, murder humans in order to feed on their blood. Had always aspired to the revelation, which angers the latter, so he accepts the offer without hesitation. Darren, on the other hand, slowly gets used to living with the other freaks in the freak campground. He starts training himself and helps others with their jobs. One day, he looks at pictures of his old life and decides to call Steve, but Larden shows up before he can. Mr. Tiny goes to the freak camp that night to talk with Mr. Long and Mr. Tall about Darren. There takes Darren's phone and breaks it. El Arton tells Darren not to leave the camp because it is no longer safe for him, and it turns out that the boy has special innate powers. Despite the fact that they are enemies, Mr. Tiny asks him to hand them over. A diplomatic Mr. Tall politely tells him that Neil will think about it later. After that, he starts teaching Darren how to handle himself if he ever gets into trouble. At first, the boy doesn't know how to help Larden, but as his training goes on, he learns how to and gets stronger. Meanwhile, Merlo transforms Steve into a vampire, giving him unimaginable powers. The boy also becomes more evil, and his first victim is his history teacher, who you gave me in. Fans can enjoy FF. Meanwhile, Darren's hunger is getting worse. In an effort to alleviate his symptoms, Lardon takes him to a nearby farm, sedates a man, and he claims that vampires never kill people. They simply get their blood. In any case, in spite of his yearning, Darren can't force himself to make it happen, so they get once again to the camp not long after the oddity's serene camping area is out of nowhere attacked by a gathering of heartless vampire. Turmoil follows as the different sides participated in a merciless battle, bringing about a great deal of carnage. The vampires soon discover Darren and Rebecca hiding in a costume room, making it clear that they are looking for him. Darren is attacked by the Japanese, and a fierce fight breaks out. Fortunately, Arton, Mr. Tall, and the other freaks arrived on time, and the fight ended, saving Darren from certain death. However, when the dust has settled and it becomes clear that Merlo has abducted Rebecca the next morning, Darren sets out to locate her while blaming himself for the. Meanwhile, in the hope of luring Darren into a trap, Mr. Tiny kidnaps his family. When Darren eventually arrives at his home, it is empty. In the following scene, Darren makes his way to the circus, where he finds Rebecca and his family tied and hung up on the wall. He is also perplexed to see Steve with the vampire despite the fact that he notices a flyer on the table inviting him to the circus. Meanwhile, Lardon also decides to join the flight and gathers his weapons. Martin also arrives and begins tussling with Merlo. Because Darren has not consumed any blood, he becomes very weak and easily bruised compared to Steve. However, Rebecca freezes herself and orders Darren to drink her blood so he can regain his energy, which he initially refuses to do. Martin then arrives and starts tussling with Merlo. But when Rebecca assures him that she will be fine, he sucks her blood elsewhere. He gets very badly hurt, but he uses all of his strength to kill Merlo by stabbing him in the heart. He immediately following. Darren and Steve get back into a fight while Mr. Tiny is watching from a distance. Having had enough, Mr. Tiny decides to get involved and stop them. He uses his special powers to revive Merlo by turning him into a dwarf, then asks the two boys to come with him. Steve is amazed by his power, and he does so right away. However, Darren does not do so after the showdown because Lardon hypnotizes the Darren family to erase their previous memories in this manner. They won't be able to recall the supernatural occurrences that occurred right in front of them. The movie comes to a close with Darren returning to the camp, where all of the freaks warmly greet him and make turn on notifications. Please subscribe for more videos like this one, and like the channel to support it. I appreciate your attention.